Good evening, friends. Welcome back to Karnataka ENT Hospital Innovative Masterclass 2020 series of programs. That is ENT Grand Rounds. This is fifth session of ENT Grand Rounds, and we have a unique topic and unique set of faculties participating in this program. That is moderator as well as speaker. Both of them are from the same institution, and also they are alumni of the same institution. A matter of fact which we should all be proud of. Let me first introduce Professor Dr. Nitin Nagarkar, who happens to be the Director of All Indians of Medical Sciences, Raipur now. I'm proud to say he was my teacher, he was my senior resident, and he was very much there when I was a resident at PJ Chandigarh. I tell you, one of the most dedicated ENT surgeon and a kind of walking encyclopedia who knew almost everything. You could stop him anywhere at any point of time and ask him some doubt, and he used to be ready with his answers, and it's under his tutelage we all grew up. And I'm proud to know that now he's a director of and CEO of All Indians of Medical Sciences Raipur, and also professor and head of the department there, of the ENT department. And he has more than 25 years of experience to his credit. He's a special interest on oncosurgery and laser surgery, and he has published more than 58 quality journals in international and national peer-reviewed journals. Okay, articles he has published, and he has been examiner to many UG, PG, and PhD examinations. I need not tell that. And coming to Dr. Rupa Mehta, and she's also an alumnus of PJ Chandigarh. Now she is an associate professor at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Raipur, and she is going to talk to us today about parathyroid lesions and underdiagnosed entity. So what I'm going to do is, to start with, I'm going to mute all, okay, to avoid the disturbances. I'm going to keep only moderator, that is Dr. Nitin sir, and Dr. Rupa. I'm going to unmute only them, okay, and
Yes.
they will be able to speak. And if you have any questions, any doubts, you can post it in the chat area. Okay, we will note those questions, and those questions will be discussed at the end of the session, so that the speaker has a uninterrupted this thing time. Okay, yeah, we will go. We will do like that. Okay, with this, I invite Dr. Rupa ji. Ma'am, you can share your slides now.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. So greetings from AIIMS Raipur. Yes.
Opening remarks.
Yes. Yes.
उधर से होता है
अभी तो चल
प्रेजेंटेशन काम नहीं कर रहा मैं डायरेक्ट
नहीं इधर से दे दो, तो मेरे को लैपटॉप ही दे दे दो आ जाएगा
हम
ठीक है. Just a second, just sorting out some issue. Okay. Yes.
No hurry, take your time, ma'am.
So today we are going to talk about parathyroid lesions, and I'm very thankful to Professor Dr. Nitin Nagarkar sir. He's been very, very busy these days because we have had steep surge of COVID-19 cases at our hospital, and end-to-end meetings and planning and organization for the same is continuing. Yet sir has taken time out of his busy schedule to be with us for this academic event. So I request sir to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rupa, and thanks very much, Dr. Prahlad. It's really a great event for all of us to be here together like this on the online platform where we can still meet up and catch up with each other. And again, I welcome everybody who is participating today. Please feel free at the end of this presentation. We can surely have a question-answer session. And I've got my team over here of my other faculty members and residents. And I'm sure that this kind of a topic that we are discussing today is quite an interesting one. And of course, we used to see those cases in the past, but possibly because of better diagnosis and the clinical suspicion that is kept by the various clinicians now across various specialties, we are possibly picking up more of such parathyroid lesions as of now. Again, I'll thank Dr. Prahlad that especially in this scenario where everybody is so much busy with COVID, we must not forget our non-COVID patients also, and they also require treatment. I think today's lecture will again focus on other aspects as well, which are so important in today's world. Thanks very much, and Dr. Rupa will take over.
Thank you, sir. I take the opportunity to thank Professor Dr. Prahlad. I have been to his center as a temporal bone course attendant and also as an observer, and it was a great learning experience. Thank you so much, sir, for providing the platform. Now, coming to the topic, parathyroid glands are very tiny glands situated in the anterior part of neck in relation to the thyroid gland. Though they're very minute, but they can cause a gamut of symptoms affecting multiple systems in the body and causing a lot of derangements in normal functioning of the body. So before we go into the details, let's have a brief recap of the parathyroid gland's anatomy and embryology, because it has a bearing on the pathology and the treatment and the surgical aspect also. So we know there are two pairs, usually two pairs of parathyroid glands, that is inferior and superior. They arise from the endoderm of the third and fourth branchial pouches during the 5th and 6th weeks of gestation, and then they migrate. The inferior parathyroid gland is basically derived from the third, the higher one, and the superior parathyroid gland is derived from the fourth branchial pouch. So it has a lesser, route of travel, whereas the inferior parathyroid gland goes from the third, which is the higher branchial pouch, to the lower position, lower destination. So it has a longer route. So there are more chances of it having ectopic presentations, which we shall see later. Now the dimensions of the parathyroid gland, as I told you, it's a very tiny gland, 5 into 3 into 1 mm in usual under normal circumstances. Weight is normally 35 to 40 milligram. Now weight increases until the age of 30 years in men and 50 years in women. It's an endocrine gland. It secretes parathormone, which is the responsible for calcium homeostasis in the body. Now 4 is a magic number. Usually we say that there are 4 parathyroid glands, but in few percentage of patients, like in almost 10 to 13% of patients, it is less than 4, that is 3 at times 3. And in around 10 to 15% of patients, we have more than 4 glands. So if it is weighing, if the extra gland is weighing at least 5 milligram or more, then it is a supernumerary gland, often found within thymus or in relation to thymus. Extra parathyroid gland, which is weighing less than 5 milligram, is rudimentary or accessory parathyroid glands. They are usually located next to the main parathyroid gland, and they can also be the source of pathology. So that is why at times you find that even after successful parathyroidectomy, the disease recurs or the disease is persistent, then these are the causes. So that is why the concept of purge parathyroidectomy has also come in for refractory hyperparathyroidism, which we shall see. Now the usual location of parathyroid gland, the superior parathyroid is more constant in location because it has a lesser route of migration. So it is located at the junction of cricothyroid and posterior lateral aspect of middle and upper third of thyroid gland. It is almost in vicinity of the intersection of inferior thyroid artery and recurrent laryngeal nerve. 80% are located within 2 centimeters of this intersection. Now, inferior parathyroid gland, majority are located in 1 centimeter diameter area around the posterior, lateral or anterolateral aspect of the lower pole of thyroid. 26% may be found in aberrant ectopic situation like thyrothymic ligament, and 6% in the more posterior part of the middle third of thyroid. Now, as we already said, because of the embryological derivation in the route of travel migration, they can have various ectopic situations. So congenital ectopy, because of abnormal migration, occurs more in lower parathyroid glands because they have a longer route. Acquired ectopy, because of movement of muscle, because of swallowing, negative intrathoracic pressure, gravity, that happens more in upper parathyroid gland. Now, the various ectopic locations we can see are So you have it in high cervical position when it is in the region of upper part of thyroid cartilage, or even in the submandibular area it is found. Subcapsular and intrathyroidal. Subcapsular is beneath the capsule of thyroid. Intrathyroidal within the thyroid parenchyma, surrounded by thyroid all over. Retroesophageal, paraesophageal, thyrothymic ligament, tracheoesophageal groove. Then you have intrathymic, anterior mediastinum in the thymus, then aortopulmonary window, posterior mediastinum. Okay, so all these aberrant ectopic locations for parathyroids are known. Now it is an endocrine gland. It secretes parathormone. The stimulus for parathormone secretion is low concentration of calcium in blood. When there is hypocalcemia in the blood, it leads to release of parathyroid hormone, which has major effects on bone, kidney, and intestine. So it leads to efflux of calcium from bone, and then it leads to increased reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys and active formulation of vitamin D, so that it acts on the intestine and leads to enhanced absorption of calcium from intestine, thereby increasing the concentration of calcium in the blood, which plays a negative feedback for the secretion of parathormone. Now, if you see the function, depending on the functional derangement, overactivity or underactivity, we can have hyperparathyroidism, which is overactivity of parathyroid gland, and underactivity is hypoparathyroidism. Now, overactivity can further be divided into primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary hyperparathyroidism mainly occurs due to parathyroid proliferative disorders like solitary parathyroid adenoma, which is most common. 85% almost is solitary parathyroid adenoma. At times, there can be double adenomas. Multiglandular disease, that is hyperplasia, parathyroid hyperplasia, on almost 10 to 15% of patients. And very rarely, that is almost less than 1% is by parathyroid carcinoma. A secondary hyperparathyroidism occurs because of chronic hypocalcemic condition, which acts as a stimulus for secretion of parathormone. For example, in renal failure, in gastrointestinal malabsorption like celiac disease, dietary rickets, anticonvulsant drugs, anticoagulant drugs, lithium, laxatives, etc. They will lead to hypocalcemia, which will lead to secretion of parathormone and secondary hyperparathyroidism. Now, tertiary hyperparathyroidism happens when the secondary hyperparathyroidism, because of that stimulus, one of the parathyroid become autonomous with development of hypercalcemia. So, condition by parathyroid hyperplasia, secondary to chronic hypocalcemia, becomes autonomous with development of hypercalcemia, is known as tertiary hyperparathyroidism. Now, the spectrum of parathyroid proliferative disorders we said is hyperplasia, adenoma, and carcinoma. Now, primary hyperparathyroidism has protean manifestations. Okay, spectrum of presentation is very, very wide, from asymptomatic presentation for a long time. It's a chronic disease also. So from asymptomatic presentation to various system manifestations to acute parathyroid crisis. So at times, because when it is in the asymptomatic phase or with vague symptoms, non-specific symptoms, then it can lead to misdiagnosis or missed diagnosis in the initial stage. This is the stage where we have to catch so that we can lead to early diagnosis and early treatment. Now, 30 to 40% of patients are asymptomatic at presentation, but remember, this is Western data. In Indian setup, it has been, more, we get more of patients with symptoms at presentation. Presentation is non-specific symptoms to multi-system involvement to acute presentation. Now, as the clinical presentation is varied, so is the biochemical phenotype. That is also varied. You can have three varieties of biochemical presentation. One is the classic form where we have hypercalcemia. Along with that, we have raised PTH, parathormone. Another one is we have hypercalcemia, but the PTH is normal. Ideally, with hypercalcemia, your PTH should be suppressed. It should be low, but it is non-suppressed PTH. That is again a subtle variant. And the third variant is normal calcium. Calcium is normal, but PTH is elevated. That is known as normocalcemic primary hyperparathyroidism. Now, in this, when you encounter such a situation, we should always get ionic calcium levels done, because at times it might happen that total calcium is normal, but ionic calcium is raised, first thing. Second is we have to rule out secondary causes, vitamin D deficiency, rickets, etc. When we diagnose this, we have to rule out secondary causes of primary hyperparathyroidism. Okay, and at times in few papers it has been described that this is a continuum. Like initially it will present as normocalcemic PHPT, that is primary hyperparathyroidism, and later it will progress to classic form. So we have to be cognizant. We should keep this also in mind. Now, the classical presentation, as has been described, is stones, bones, moans, and groans. Stones, that is renal afflictions, are there in nephrocalcinosis, nephrolithiasis, urolithiasis, renal cyst, very, very common. Okay, gastrointestinal disturbances in the form of peptic ulcer disease, pancreatitis, neuromuscular manifestations in the form of muscle pain, weakness. Okay, and asymptomatic presentation will be with very vague symptoms: fatigue, muscle pain, weakness, nausea, constipation, heartburn, frequent urination, trouble concentrating, depression, anxiety, neuropsychiatric symptoms, etc. Now, the skeletal manifestations are also very, very common. Bone deformity, especially in growing age, growing skeleton. You can have genu valgum, we can have spinal deformities, then pathological fractures because of bone weakening, then cyst, brown tumors, osteopenia, osteoporotic bone is very, very common in hyperparathyroidism because of efflux of calcium from bone, so bones get fragile. Neuropsychiatric disorders and cardiovascular effects in the form of hypertension, cardiac arrhythmias, and all are seen. Now, acute presentation of parathyroid crisis is seen as it's a life-threatening emergency when you have severe hypercalcemia, that is more than 14 milligram per deciliter of calcium is present with signs and symptoms of multi-organ failure. So the patients will present with GI symptoms, neurological symptoms, renal failure, cardiac rhythm abnormalities. Now, initially it was advocated that you should go ahead with emergency parathyroidectomy within 72 hours of presentation. But now with medical management, it can be, like it can act as a bridge to surgery, and we can rapidly reduce the serum calcium levels and then take up the patient for surgery within a week, within 7 to 8 days. That is fine for management of this crisis. Now, it is said that hyperparathyroidism is mainly in middle-aged and elderly people. But in pediatric population, though it is less common as compared to adults, it is seen and it has to be recognized, because here also it can manifest with, first of all, it can manifest with severe disease. Second thing is it can be crippling because the skeleton is growing. And it can be, like debilitating for the patient. The growth is retarded, etc. So we'll see incidence of hyperparathyroidism in children is 2 to 5 per 100,000 patients as compared to 1 per 1,000 patients in adults. In most adult series, 30 to 40% of patients are asymptomatic. However, in pediatric, only 0 to 20% of patients are asymptomatic at presentation. Now, there's a severe form which occurs in neonates, which is known as neonatal severe hyperparathyroidism. It happens because of inactivating mutations leading to CASR gene, that is calcium sensing receptor gene, is absent and or hypofunctioning. And that leads to parathyroid hyperplasia, unregulated PTH secretion, and severe hypercalcemia. So it presents in the first few days of life with failure to thrive, hypotonia, and respiratory distress. It should be differentiated, however, from transient hyperparathyroidism, which happens in kids, because neonates specifically because of low maternal calcium, that is maternal hypocalcemia. So that is transient, but this is severe and needs to be treated urgently. Now, there's a less severe form that is known as familial hypocalciuric hypercalcemia. That happens because of reduced levels of calcium sensing receptors, resulting in modest elevation of PTH and mild hypercalcemia. This is also seen in adults, which we'll see later when we see the workup. Now, primary hyperparathyroidism in pregnancy. Now, it's a very, very unique presentation because it is more complex. Right from managing, diagnosing, that is localizing studies to drugs we cannot give. Surgery has to be, thought over properly because of the various effects on fetus and mother. So management of primary hyperthyroidism in pregnancy is more complex. Women who are diagnosed with primary hyperparathyroidism before pregnancy, when we're planning to conceive, should be advised to undergo surgery before conception. And it should be investigated in those females with compatible symptoms and allied pathologies like recurrent miscarriage, hypertension, hyperemesis gravidarum, etc. Risk of primary hyperparathyroidism to mother and fetus increase with biochemical severity. That it is concordant. If the calcium levels are high, the risk also becomes high. Complication rates of primary hyperthyroidism in pregnancy have been estimated to be 68.7% in mother and 80% in the fetus. So it needs to be recognized and treated accordingly, case by case basis. Now, preoperative evaluation of the patient. Complete history taking regarding all the non-specific and system directed, like the organ directed history has to be taken. Along with that, we also have to consider history of prior neck irradiation, because that predisposes to diseases of the parathyroid. Evaluation of vocal cord function is very, very important because it entails risk to the recurrent laryngeal nerve if you are surgically treating. Medications, history is to be taken: lithium, anticonvulsant, anticoagulants, thiazide diuretics. Then if the patient is taking any medication which has calcium or vitamin D chronically, so that also has to be ruled out. Assessment of thyroid gland is to be done because 20 to 40% of patients with parathyroid disease might also harbor concomitant thyroid disease. Vice versa, it is less. Thyroid disease with parathyroid, it is almost 0.3 to 1.6%. But parathyroid disease with thyroid, it is almost 20 to 40%. So that is important. Family history is to be taken if such a family history is there, because familial and hereditary form of hyperparathyroidism is also known. Now, preoperative workup of the patient. We have to get few lab investigation done. First of all, calcium to document hypercalcemia. Then you have parathormone levels has to be done if the hypercalcemia is there. Magnesium, because magnesium homeostasis is very, very intimately linked with calcium homeostasis. Phosphates, alkaline phosphatase, that is a marker of bone turnover. Then 24-hour urinary calcium. This is very, very important to distinguish it from familial hypocalciuric hypercalcemia, which we'll see later, because that requires medical treatment. That is not surgically treated. So we have to differentiate with this. Vitamin D levels, urea, creatinine to rule out secondary hyperparathyroidism. Okay. So diagnosis is basically biochemical. Imaging, there is ultrasound neck and other forms of imaging help us to localize and surgically plan. But diagnosis is basically biochemical. So imaging studies to localize our ultrasound neck. As we all know, it is non-invasive, it is no radiation risk. Okay, so and it can also diagnose concomitant thyroid disease along with. Okay, 4D CT scan in which the routine CT with hyperfusion studies are done. So that is very, very useful in localizing parathyroid disease, but it has more radiation. Sestamibi radionuclide scan alone or with SPECT is again very helpful in localizing, and skeletal X-rays to see the various effects on bones are routinely done for the diagnosis and management. Now, familial hypocalciuric hypercalcemia is one disorder which we have to differentiate when we are working up, and that is done by 24-hour urinary calcium. It is basically managed with medical management. It is an autosomal dominant disorder of renal calcium sensing receptor that mimics primary hyperparathyroidism. It presents with long-standing hypercalcemia. Urinary calcium levels are less than 100 milligram per 24 hours, and calcium to creatinine ratio is less than 0.01. Now, this is a table which which is like comparing the various modalities, the imaging modalities, the non-invasive and the invasive. Normally, nowadays, with non-invasive, it mostly suffices only in refractory cases or in very aberrant, like where we are not able to localize, do we have to resort to invasive cases, like modalities, that is angiography, jugular venous sampling, etc. FRSA and biopsy, however, are not recommended, and mostly these localizing studies help us in going ahead more confidently during surgery and recognizing the disease gland. Now, what to do once we've established the diagnosis, you've localized, what to do? The treatment remains surgical. Surgical is curative. Surgical resection is curative for this disease. Now, traditionally, what has been done is conventional bilateral neck exploration, and it still remains the gold standard, especially in multiglandular disease, because 10 to 15% of patients present with multiglandular disease. Okay, but nowadays with better imaging modalities and intraoperative adjuncts like IOPTH assay, that is intraoperative parathyroid assay, radio guided surgery, we can go ahead with focused parathyroidectomy and unilateral exploration or directed parathyroidectomy. The results of both are almost similar. The complications theoretically should be less with the minimally invasive, but in experienced hands and in high volume centers, even conventional bilateral neck exploration has very less morbidity. Now, the indications of parathyroidectomy are very well defined. Age less than 50 years, you should go ahead with parathyroidectomy because the lifespan is long. In almost 15 years, all these symptoms of parathyroidectomy will manifest. So, age less than 50 years, all patients should undergo parathyroidectomy. All symptomatic patients, whatever skeletal manifestations, renal manifestations, all of them should undergo parathyroidectomy. Asymptomatic patients with the following criteria: calcium more than 1 milligram per deciliter above normal range. DEXA scan T-score less than 2.5, minus 2.5 at lumbar spine, femoral neck, and distal radius. Vertebral fractures, estimated GFR, that is glomerular filtration rate, less than 60 ml per minute. Urinary calcium excretion more than 400 milligram 24 hours, because that will disposes to stone formation, nephrolithiasis, and nephrocalcinosis. Asymptomatic patients unable to undergo medical surveillance and asymptomatic patients desiring definitive surgical management are also the indications for parathyroidectomy. What are the goals of parathyroidectomy? You remove the abnormal gland, one or more, depending on the pathology. Preserve the normal gland. That is again very important. You do not have to land up the patient to hypoparathyroidism. Treat the associated thyroid disease and avoid complications. So if you see the surgical, there are two broad categories, that is bilateral neck exploration or focused parathyroidectomy. Bilateral neck exploration is done when you are suspecting multiglandular disease, when there's a family history of syndrome, like family syndromic history, like MEN1A, MEN2A, primary hyperparathyroidism with the jaw tumor syndrome. Then concomitant thyroid disorder is there. Parathyroid localization studies are negative or discordant. Then IOPTH does not fall after. Like you removed the offending gland, which you thought is the offending gland, but still the PTH does not fall. Then you are supposed to check the other side as well. So it is what we do is we explore all the glands and remove the enlarged or the diseased gland. Intraoperative histopathologic frozen section can be done. Complication rate is 1 to 3% and cure rate is 95 to 99%. With focused parathyroidectomy, it's done when you have preoperative very well localization of the gland, the offending gland is there, or patient with sporadic PHPT, where we are sure that it is mostly like it will turn out to be a single gland involvement. So there you go ahead with focused parathyroidectomy, unilateral exploration, intraoperative PTH monitoring. It can be done under local or regional anesthesia. It can be it's a daycare surgery when the skeletal is not involved. If the skeleton is involved, then the hungry bone syndrome and all things happen, and then it requires hospitalization. Complication rate is 1 to 2%. and cure rate is also 93 to 99%. Now, this focused parathyroidectomy gained more acceptance and all because of these intraoperative adjuncts like intraoperative PTH assay. It is based on the premise that parathormone has half-life of 5 minutes. So what is done is baseline PTH level is determined after induction of anesthesia just prior to making an incision. At times before handling the gland also one more PTH is done, and then PTH levels are checked again after 5, 10, 15 minutes. At times routinely at our center we do it after 15 minutes after the enlarged gland is removed. A drop in IO-PTH levels of more than 50% from the baseline pre-surgical excision value is considered curative resection. Now, at times when when we have dilemma of the gland, the offending gland, we're not able to localize pre-operatively properly. Then what we do is we can also use gamma probe intraoperatively to find out. So radio guidance can be done. In this, we pre-operatively inject intravenous technetium 99M System 1 to 2 hours prior to surgery. And during the surgery, use of a handheld gamma probe intraoperatively to localize hyperfunctioning parathyroid gland. Once the gland is removed, an ex vivo radionuclide count of 20% or more of background counts indicates appropriate removal of hyperfunctioning gland. Equally effective in children as well as in adults. Despite in children we have very small adenomas, yet it is equally effective in diagnosis. So when you say it is cured, intraoperative, if the levels drop to 50% at 10 minutes, then you say that okay, we have removed the offending gland. And after parathyroidectomy, if the calcium level should remain normal, like eucalcemia is obtained for 6 months and after, even after if the eucalcemia is there, then we say that the cure has been attained. Now the post-operative course. Post-operative course, the most important thing which you have to monitor is calcium and magnesium. What happens is that once the parathormone levels reduces, the more calcium, because the bones are deprived of calcium because of chronic hyperparathyroidism, more influx of calcium occurs into the skeleton to meet the needs of rebound bone formation, while bone reabsorption is arrested. So it leads to rapid and prolonged hypocalcemia, hypophosphatemia, and hypomagnesemia. This is known as hungry bone syndrome, and it is reported in 25 to 90% of patients with radiological evidence of hyperparathyroid bone disease versus only 0 to 6% of patients without skeletal involvement. Treatment is calcium. You have to supplement calcium, magnesium, and active metabolites of vitamin D. Adequate correction of calcium and normalization of bone turnover is required for resolution of hypocalcemia, which may last for a few months. Almost, it has been said in the literature, 4 to 13 months after successful surgery. So this is how post-operative charts look like. We have you routinely get calcium done, calcium and PTH done, and monitor. So this is how it drastically it falls from more than 1900 falls to 69.3. So drastically, last week we operated a patient whose pre-excision value was 533, and before that pre-operative value was 784. And after surgery, 15 minutes after surgery, was sent the sample. It turned out it fell down to 67. So we have to monitor calcium, magnesium levels routinely after surgery. Now, how to define outcome? It is by long-term calcium levels rather than PTH levels. And when we say it is persistent disease, when the calcium remains elevated, the calcium levels remain elevated after surgery, or initially it normalizes, but within becomes again high within 6 months of surgery. So then it is known as persistent disease or operative failure. Recurrent disease happens when it had reached eucalcemia, but then again it increases, hypercalcemia happens after 6 months. So that is known as recurrent disease. Now to persistent or recurrent disease, we need to reevaluate again. And however, the threshold for resurgery has to be high. You need not like straight away go, because it is associated with more morbidity, and you have to you have to decide and fulfill all the criteria and then go ahead with redo surgery, because redo surgery is always more difficult than the primary surgery. Now, because of incidence of these recurrent or persistent disease, especially in multiglandular disease or secondary hyperparathyroidism, the concept of seed, soil, and environment. Seed is parathyroid cell rest, soil is the migration route, and environment. What happens is these nests happen, nest of cells which can get diseased and lead to hyperparathyroidism. So what is the purge parathyroidectomy has been described in few papers, where they say they remove everything from thyroid cartilage, like all fibrofatty tissue and glandular tissue, from thyroid cartilage, carotid arteries to innominate arteries, all the fibrofatty and glandular tissue, so that all this nest of cells which are seen here is removed. But this is very not like routinely done, but it has been described. So what happens? Like what are the benefits from surgical management? It's a very, very efficacious surgery. It reverses almost like quite a few of the derangements which have happened. Renal function does not deteriorate. Nephrocalcinosis and all takes time to resolve, but at least new stones don't form. and bone density improves, fractures probability reduces, resolution of neuropsychiatric symptoms happen, quality of life gets better, even survival has been found to be prolonged. Then 10% reduction if the patient is left untreated. Then reduction in cardiovascular incidents, low complication rates, and cost of parathyroidectomy is very cost effective. So this is how the kidney stone risk and the hip fracture and reduced risk of any fracture after parathyroidectomy. Neuropsychiatric changes also improve. So this is very interesting paper. See, we know that it can be diagnosed easily. It is a very efficacious surgery. Treatment is available. Yet we find that various papers have showing that we are not able to diagnose. Like it is a very underdiagnosed condition, and a misdiagnosis happens routinely. In this very interesting paper, what happened was that what they have done is 432 patients had hypercalcemia, but out of these, only 3,200 were referred for parathyroid evaluation. And even out of these, when parathyroid is found to be high, or like when parathyroid hormone is done, yet even lesser proportion goes to for surgical referral and specialist referral. So that is very important. We have to make our other people, general practitioners, physicians, and other people get aware of this condition, and that treatment is available and efficacious treatment. It is very efficacious, so needs to be told, and so that we can catch the patients at early stage. This is again showing this undiagnosed and under-recognized primary prevalence of undiagnosed and under-recognized primary hyperparathyroidism. In this again, we find very interesting that of hypercalcemic patients, 67% never had PTH obtained, and 28% of whom were likely to have primary hyperparathyroidism. So it is estimated that 43% of hypercalcemic patients are likely to have primary hyperparathyroidism. Okay, so it's a common disorder that is it is a more common disorder, but because it is not diagnosed, it is not that it is considered to be rare. So it is crucial to evaluate even mild hypercalcemia, because 43% of these patients have primary hyperparathyroidism. Under recognition of the benefits of parathyroidectomy leads to underdiagnosis of disease. This was again a very interesting paper. Then why is hyperparathyroidism underdiagnosed and undertreated in older adults? This paper is also very interesting. It states that at times it is not hypercalcemia is it is done. You have the values, but it is not acknowledged. And if it is acknowledged, it is not evaluated. If it is evaluated, it is not referred. At times, because of considering the risk of surgery or considering wait and watch policy. So these are all various things which have been discussed, which we need to rectify and understand. Now coming to our experience of managing 10 patients of parathyroid adenoma at our institute, all the patients have been symptomatic. They have presented to, in fact, to other departments, mostly to orthopedics department. Most of them have been referred from orthopedics. This lady was the first of our patients who had gone to oral maxillofacial department for maxillary cyst. That was done, the surgery was done, and again that recurred. And then the calcium levels were done, which was high, and then PTH levels showed hyperparathyroidism. And then she was referred to us, and we got her investigated with scan and all, and then she underwent parathyroidectomy. It was a giant parathyroid adenoma in this patient. And this is the age range was 13 to 50 years. 8 females and 2 male patients. Out of the 2 male, one is a young boy with these all the skeletal deformities. Now after treatment, he has grown in height, grown in weight, and now he looks much more robust. And 3 patients, palpable neck swelling. However, they did not present to us with palpable neck swelling. Only after they were referred with the diagnosis of hypercalcemia and this, and when we palpated, we could find a neck swelling. In other patients, we could not even find, even on palpating, we could not find. So it's not the presenting symptom in parathyroidism, hyperparathyroidism. Now, almost all of our patients have skeletal abnormalities. This is a young lady who was referred from orthopedics department. She was operated, bone curettage, and this bone cement was put for a lytic cyst in the tibia. So she had then she was diagnosed to have hypercalcemia and referred to us. This is the same boy with the genu valgum. Then this is another patient with the pathological fracture of the humerus and the cyst in the humerus. This is again another patient with the lytic lesions in the humerus and pathological fractures. This young girl presented to us with spinal deformity. There's wedging at the D12-L1 level, and she was literally crippled. She could not walk. She was so weak that she needed support for walking, and she was walking very, very minimally. But after surgery, she's improved, and now with physiotherapy, gradual physiotherapy and all, she's on her way to recovery. So almost all the patients had hypercalcemia. Calcium was in the range of 13.5 to 18.2. These patient with this much 18.2 milligram patient, like this was in hypercalcemic crisis, which was first managed endocrine in the endocrinology department with the IV fluids and bisphosphonates and all, and then was referred to us for surgical management. All our patients undergo complete thorough evaluation at the endocrinology department and then are referred to us. So raised parathormone has been seen in all patients, 400 to 2000 microgram per ml. Elevated alkaline phosphatase because all of our patients had skeletal manifestations. Urinary 24-hour calcium excretion was done. Renal stones were found in 4 patients, nephrocalcinosis in 3 patients, and renal cyst in 3 patients. Acute necrotizing pancreatitis was there in 1 patient. Patient had episodes of vomiting, then this was diagnosed and surgical consultation was taken. In hypercalcemic crisis, 1 patient which was managed at endocrine department and then sent to us. Then out of 10 patients, 3 had superior parathyroid involvement and 7 had inferior parathyroid involvement. Now this is the CT scan showing the lesion in the left parathyroid gland, superior parathyroid gland. No, left inferior parathyroid. This is again right parathyroid, so right parathyroid gland. Yeah, giant parathyroid. This lady with the maxillary cyst. Yeah. Then we have this is the small gland in the right side inferior parathyroid adenoma. The system will be scanned localizing the right inferior parathyroid adenoma. Increased tracer uptake. This is again the system will be scanned for one of our patients, which again showed right inferior parathyroid adenoma. Along with that, there were skeletal manifestation in the head and proximal part of humerus. You can see here. This. Yeah, here you can see, and this is the parathyroid adenoma. Then again, this is the lady with the tibial cyst and all. So she had multiple bones involvement in the skull, in mandible, in bilateral clavicles, head of bilateral femur and tibia. So this is the patient which was operated last week. This was inferior parathyroid adenoma, right side, and it was very like this was one of the few cases in which it was very easy. I would like sir to comment on this.
Yeah, I think Dr. Rupa has very well shown how we can pick up these lesions, and of course we'll go to the discussion part. But one thing is very sure that these kinds of very small lesions cannot be picked up clinically per se unless we go to the history like she has shown, and of course the biochemical investigations. So more often than not, it's the system scan which tells us about the accurate location of the parathyroid adenoma. Sometimes it's a parathyroid hyperplasia. Very rarely we see the large ones, which of course we did encounter, but this one was relatively very superficial. As soon as we, entered into the neck and we in fact retracted the strap muscles, we could see the lesion. And because the system scan is very sensitive and specific, and anatomically also it exactly correlated with the anterior wall of the trachea on the medial aspect. It was just lateral to the anterolateral wall of the trachea and just inferior to the inferior pole of the thyroid gland. So much easy to locate, and we knew that this was the only functioning gland because the system scan picks up very well, even if there were other hyperplastic glands. And of course, the parathyroid hormone immediately, which was done intraoperatively, and we also showed it immediately it came down to less than I think 62 or something. And we also got a frozen section which showed it was a parathyroid tissue, and then of course we usually get it as parathyroid. Yeah.
This is again one of our previous patients, the lady with the maxillary cyst. This was giant parathyroid adenoma, almost 3 centimeter. They say it is more than 3.5 milligram and more than 2 centimeter size. It is a giant, so it fulfilled all the criteria of giant parathyroid adenoma. And the patient is doing very well. It's on regular follow-up. Then this is again one of the patients. This is inferior parathyroid adenoma because it is anterior to the recurrent laryngeal nerve.
You can show that.
Yes. This is the recurrent laryngeal nerve, and this is the parathyroid adenoma anterior to the plane of the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Then this is again one of the large parathyroid adenoma we had. This is an interesting. This was again this 2 cases only were superficial location. This is one. The one was which we did last week, and this is the second one which was slightly superficial in location. Otherwise, we had to like hunt for it, but this was quite superficial in position. This was superior parathyroid. And this is again a small parathyroid adenoma, which was excised. And this is a very interesting case. This was a very rare case we discussed with the pathologist after this thing. This is thymolipoadenoma, which had components of thymic components, fat component, and adenoma, that is parathyroid tissue in this. So this was done. This was a middle-aged lady, and she was operated, and she's doing fine now. So before we end off this, just to give completeness and just to understand the importance and is hypoparathyroidism we'll discuss. There are multiple causes like autoimmune and idiopathic, etc. But we'll focus on post-surgical hypoparathyroidism, which happens mostly after surgery. That is mostly after thyroid surgeries. So we should be very, very aware of this fact that saving parathyroids is equally, or if not more, important than recurrent meningeal nerve. Parathyroid are to be identified and kept intact and with vascularity preserved. That is the most important factor in preventing hypoparathyroidism, specifically when you're doing total thyroidectomies. So how does injury happen? It happens because of direct tissue trauma, that is mechanical or thermal. Then you have injury to vascular particle, inadvertent removal of parathyroids during surgery, or even intentional removal when you are doing central compartment neck dissection, malignancy of thyroid. So what all, like everyone of us is aware, but yet just to reiterate the importance, we'll just see what all, precautions we can take so as to reduce the chances of injury to parathyroids. One is to not ligate the inferior thyroid artery trunk, ligate the branches close to thyroid capsule, because the major supply to parathyroids comes from inferior thyroid artery. Avoid direct cauterization of parathyroids or in the vicinity of parathyroids. Third, or keep the bipolar to the minimum in case some bleeding happens. Try to control it by pressure, and if at all you have to do, you have to be very, very careful with the saline and keeping the settings of bipolar cautery to the minimum. Careful dissection of thyroid capsules should be performed. Gently moving away the parathyroids without causing tissue or vascular trauma. In central compartment lymph node dissection, the inferior parathyroids are at greater risk. So first, what we have to do is we have to identify and keep the superior thyroids intact, parathyroids intact, so that even if inferior parathyroids are intact, are damaged, we at least have two parathyroids functioning. Inspect thyroid after removal of parathyroid. Always, this is very, very important that whenever we remove total thyroidectomy, we should always check if parathyroid has inadvertently removed in the specimen. If so, then we should auto-transplant it in the forearm or in the neck muscles. So as depending on the pathology which was there. So it should be always retransplanted. So to conclude, accurate early diagnosis is very important in diagnosing parathyroid lesions, and multidisciplinary management is very, very important because we have a multi-system involvement, and complete endocrinology workup is very, very important. Primary hyperparathyroidism is very, very important cause of reversible, most common cause of reversible hypercalcemia. And the bone disease also is reversible. It has a varied spectrum of clinical presentation, so we should be aware and of the same. Then thorough knowledge of embryology and anatomy is required for successful parathyroidectomy as well as parathyroid preservation in neck surgeries. And our aim should be to diagnose primary hyperparathyroidism cases early before complications occur. So my sincere gratitude to Director Sir, to Professor Prahlad, to our departmental colleagues, senior and junior residents, and the patients who teach more than any textbook can teach. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hearty congratulations, Dr. Rupaji, for that wonderful presentation. You guys have, quite a good number of cases. We don't see them quite often, but the AIIMS being one of the major referral center, probably you must be getting a lot of cases. So you can look at the questions at the chart there, or should I ask questions?
No, sir, I'll read it out.
Yeah, you can read it out. Dr. Prakash Munka, sir, one of the senior surgeons from Bokaro. So he wants to know, like, what are the other causes of hypercalcemia? I think this is a generalized question. I think what would be important here is how to differentiate, the other causes of hypercalcemia from the parathyroid-induced calcemia.
Yes. So hypercalcemia is also seen in malignancy. That is one cause, so that we have to rule out. Second thing is parathyroid induced. Whenever you find hypercalcemia without any directing cause, like if there's no other cause identified, then you should always get PTH levels. If PTH levels are high, then it is parathyroid induced. Yeah. Another thing can be like you have to these other causes that we discussed can be associated with syndromes. And another thing which we have to keep in mind is like this familial hypercalcemia. So whenever you find hypercalcemia, medicine referral, if not endocrinology referral, has to be done to properly evaluate the disease.
Dr. Munka, Dr. Munka, good evening. How are you? It's nice to listen to you. And I think Dr. Rupa is very well told that once you have hypercalcemia, of course, based upon the other clinical presentations, it is the parathyroid hormone level which is again very important. So of course, I think that's why even that where she showed that most of these cases were missed, because had the physicians or surgeons been more persistent, after they have, seen these patients that this hypercalcemia has not improved, the next logical step would be to get the parathormone levels. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
that is very critical. Parathormone levels are very critical in these cases. The next question is from Dr. Hassan Segana. He wants to know what is the role of choline PET CT in localization. Are you using it? Is there a role? Choline PET CT?
Yeah, there is a role, but at present we're not using because these traces are not available. We discussed with the nuclear medicine specialist. So in due course of time, she has said that because a lot of studies are coming up, which say that this is even a better modality.
She's with us here.
Yes, Mudalsha, yeah.
I think we'll take her comments.
Mudalsha madam is there, so I'll request her to give her comments.
Okay. Yeah.
Dr. Mudalsha.
Yeah, she'll give. Meanwhile, we can continue.
Yes, we can continue.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. And Dr. Satya Chaudhary wants to know, like, have you seen any brown tumors?
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. That in fact, majority of the patients who came to us, came from the orthopedics department or pediatrics departments, and of course, one or two did come from the dental. So they had either brown tumors or they had aneurysmal bone cysts, and of course, nephrocalcinosis or occasionally pancreatitis. So most of these patients did have bone lesions, and the commonest lesion were of the brown tumors.
Yeah, even looking at the surgical pictures, it was quite obvious. It was a brown tumor. Yeah, and the rounds name not specified. This doctor would like to know, do you advise using microscope during surgery intraop to identify the parathyroids? Because your tumors, you've shown the pictures you have shown is they were quite big. It was very obvious. But do you routinely use microscope while operating parathyroids?
Yeah, we use loops, but at times even microscope we have been using because at times if it is difficult to identify it's a small tumor, then we can trace the inferior thyroid artery branch to that. So that is loop or microscope.
Okay.
For this.
Okay, even loop is good enough for this thing, but microscope when necessary.
Yeah, I think loop or a microscope is fine, and like Dr. Rupa mentioned, keep in mind because majority were of course the inferior ones, but of course you have to look for the superior parathyroids as well. But inferior thyroid artery and recurrent laryngeal nerve will surely give you a clue to the lesion if you have not picked it up so well on the SESTA-MIB scan. Okay.
Yeah, right. And do you routinely use neuromonitor in these cases?
No, at present we're not using.
Okay. Yeah. You're using loop anyway, so no monitor anyway. You identify the nerve beforehand. So Dr. Munka is again asking, before surgery, how to prepare the patient? Any conservative treatment at your center?
Pre-operative, mostly like if the patient is present with hypercalcemia, like calcium is very, very high, then it is managed with endocrinology consultation by saline, like giving saline and bisphosphonates. And other therapies have also been described, but mostly at our center, like our endocrinologist prefers saline and bisphosphonates to get down the calcium levels to literally like to near about normal, and then we go ahead with the surgery. Vitamin D supplementation pre-op is done. Vitamin D levels are routinely done, and if it is less, we give start vitamin D supplementation pre-operatively only. There are few papers which say that pre-operative is not which say for both sides, like they say pre-operative should not be done, but most of the papers still say that pre-operative supplementation does help. So we give routine vitamin D supplementation pre-operatively also, and get calcium levels to, like if it is very, very high, then we get it to near normal, and then we go ahead with surgery.
Yeah, I mean, these dearrangements of calcium levels, can they cause any anesthetic problems intra-op if you don't correct them?
I think, pancreatitis is one, and one or two patients did have that problem. You see, if you've got very high levels of calcium, then you can have other problems associated with it, especially if the levels are more than 15, 16, and one or two patients did have that. So there are certain complications which are associated, but I think our anesthetist definitely manage it. We usually would like to normalize the patient to some extent, of course, before we take up for surgery, and the endocrinologist does help us in that.
Yeah, it's quite sensible enough, sir. And this is a question about post-op follow-up. That is, when do you repeat serum calcium and parathormone after surgery, and how frequently you do it?
Yeah, serum calcium, till the hungry bone syndrome is there, it is done almost twice a day. Because the patients go towards hypocalcemia, like the levels will be 12, 11, 9, 8, it will fall. So we had patients will start having, because the patients were used to having high calcium levels. So they'll start having features of tetanil, like Chvostek sign positive, Trousseau sign positive at even 9, 8. So that we have to follow up and supplement calcium accordingly. Once the hungry bone syndrome is like taken care of, then we need not get the calcium levels done so frequently. And along with calcium, we also get done magnesium levels, because both of them are magnesium. Hypomagnesemia is also common with calcium. So when you correct hypomagnesemia, the calcium gets corrected easily. So that is again.
And again, magnesium is very important also. So, you know, that also has a tendency to fall and needs to be corrected, of course, equally along with the calcium. And like Dr. Rupa very rightly said, it's definitely commensurate with the fall in the parathormone. Here you have the PTH falling down. At the same time, you can see morning the calcium was 9, by evening it comes to 8.5, next day morning comes to 8. You see, it's a good trend. It shows a falling trend. But one of the major reasons is the major osteoclastic activity which was occurring in the bone gets changed to the osteoblastic activity. And all these bone cysts would now actually require more calcium now. And the other, parathyroid glands, suppose you have removed one, the other 3 have virtually gone to sleep because they have been suppressed all this while. And that is the reason why all of a sudden you are having a hypocalcemia. Along with that, you have the hungry bones as well. So I think you have to definitely give calcium for a longer duration, of course, in these cases.
I think having a presence of mind and clinically following up, as both of you stressed, I think that's very important. Dr. Kamruddin Ezi Waliloa from Mumbai, one of the senior most laryngologist surgeon, and he's asking, what do you do for hyperfunctioning parathyroids?
Hyperfunctioning parathyroids will lead to hyperparathyroidism. So we have to evaluate completely and then do localizing studies to find out whether it's a single gland disease, like mostly 85% it's a single parathyroid adenoma, or multiglandular disease. So I'll just cover multiglandular disease also in this, because that question has also been asked. So if it is, then we'll identify whether it's single gland or multiple gland. Depending on that, and depending on the calcium and PTH levels, and seeing the other patient factors also, we take the patient up for surgery. Now, if it's single gland disease, well localized, then we go ahead with focused parathyroidectomy. If it is multiple gland disease, then what we do is bilateral neck exploration, identify the disease glands, remove. If it is syndromic, then at times, all glands or 3 glands, 4 glands are removed. So if that is there, we remove the glands, and if seemingly normal gland is preserved, and if at all, a few grams of it has to be preserved, and it can be reimplanted, auto-transplanted also in the forearm.
Yeah, right. Dr. OSC Magdumi is asking, he missed the lecture. He's asking me, will this video be available online on YouTube or website? So do I have permission to post this, both of you?
Okay.
Can I post it on website or YouTube?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So next, Dr. Ripu Daman Arora, he's from Raipur. He's asking, he's congratulating you for the wonderful presentation. He's asking how to manage multiple hyperplasia glands surgically.
Yeah, this is what I said. You remove the disease gland 3. If all 4 seem to be involved, then you remove 3.5. Keep a seemingly normal gland and auto transplant it in the forearm or so that total hyperparathyroidism does not occur. But otherwise, you have to remove and auto transplant. You have to remove the involved glands. That is the treatment for this.
Yeah. Dr. Hassan Segana is again asking the duration of follow-up of primary hyperparathyroidism post parathyroidectomy. I think these patients have to be followed up lifelong, I believe. You have anything to say, sir?
I think we do it much longer. Yes, very true. Some of the children came, when they were, I think, 8 or 10 years of age, and now they've grown up. We have seen them growing up, and somebody like Rupa has mentioned, I know of one girl and one boy, they were so crippled, they were unable to even move. Even the bed, if you touch their arm, they would have a pathological fracture. To start seeing them walking around almost like normal individuals, it's a great thing. But you, of course, need to follow them up. Of course, you need to do their calcium levels and occasionally parathyroid. Or only one case we had to do the surgery again because there was one lesion developing, on the other side, which was initially not shown on the system. Maybe we had, of course, palpated that side. But fortunately, the other patients did not require any surgery further on. But they certainly need to be followed up lifelong as far as possible. Yes, of course.
Yeah, right. So Incidentally, you spoke about a second look, a recurrent lesion. So incidentally, there is a question from Dr. Sharath. He's asking second look parathyroid surgery. So what is the special pre and intra preparation care you take?
Yeah, second look parathyroid surgery, the threshold has to be kept high. It is not that a few, like 1 or 2 readings you get high and you operate. So you have to be completely thoroughly work up, because the morbidity is more, and chances of, causing injury to recurrent laryngeal nerve, to causing chronic hypoparathyroidism is more. So we have to be very, very careful in selecting those patients. A thorough investigation, biochemical as well as localizing studies have to be done, including invasive studies to be done to identify the gland, and then go ahead with the redo surgery, because it is not that easily identified. That is why we have to go ahead with redo surgery. At times it can be ectopic or supernumerary gland, so that is why it was not identified initially. So that has to be taken care of, and there are definite guidelines by the various societies regarding indications for redo surgery, which we could not cover because of lack of time, but it has to be very stringent criteria before we take up the redo surgery.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Dr. Mohan is asking, what are the chances of hypocalcemia post-operatively? There are a lot of chances. I mean, you want to say any comment about this?
I think hypocalcemia, especially if you've had all those bone cysts, you're most likely going to develop a hungry bone syndrome. And as I said, if you have one large gland, not just hyperplasia, if you have an adenoma, especially the giant ones, it's definitely that the other three glands have been suppressed by that time. And so, you're very likely to have hypocalcemia and hypomagnesemia in the postoperative period. You need to very well monitor these cases, give extra calcium, injectable as required for the first maybe few days. And all that calcium actually goes to the bones, and these patients actually, their bone symptoms start improving very well after that. So I think that post-operative management is also equally important. And the endocrinologist has already evaluated the patient preoperatively. We continue with the consultation in the post-op period as well.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Devi Dugadas is asking, despite having serum calcium of about 9 mg%, patient still has tetany. So what should we do? What should we give?
Yeah. So see, because this patient is developing signs and symptoms of tetany at this level, because the patient was used to having higher levels of calcium. And that is, most of it is going into the bone, causing less, causing these symptoms. So we have to evaluate magnesium also along with this, and we have to give a supplement calcium and active form of vitamin D, because vitamin D less vitamin D is also most of the times less or depleted in these type of patients. Vitamin D supplementation, calcium supplementation, and magnesium supplementation. There's another question which says how to give magnesium. So magnesium level is corrected by oral or IM, IV injections are given, but mainly it is oral ultra magnesium tablets are there, 200 mg. So normally you give those BD, and at times if it is like very less, like in the last patient we operated was 0.915. So we had to give intramuscular IV Maxelf 1 gram after endocrine consultation we gave. But that is not routinely given. That is given with the ECG monitoring and all. So normally with the oral magnesium correction, it does resolve.
Yeah. Dr. Rupa Parikh ma'am asked, like, how is magnesium level corrected? I think that answers your answer. Answer this question too. Okay. And for auto transplant sternomastoid forearm, how do you? Yeah, Dr. Subhash Garg is asking from Kanpur, for auto transplant sternomastoid or forearm, how do you decide? Like,
I think for us it's very simple. Once you're opening the neck, the sternocleidomastoid is just next to your strap muscle. So I think we generally, rather than giving a separate incision, would rather auto transplant we make small pockets in the fibers of the gland, and in the past we slice it into bits. Some people make it into 2 or 3 bits, and then most likely it will take up the vascularization, because initially it will be devascularized, but over a period of time it does take up. And it can be demonstrated even on a scan post-operatively, and a system will be scanned, that the gland is actually functioning. It can be demonstrated like that if required, of course, in those cases.
Yeah, that's right, sir. So do you routinely do frozen section or the intraoperative parathermal estimation routinely?
Yeah, for all cases.
For all cases.
PTH and frozen section as well, because that's incorroborating. So.
Yeah. There are compliments from Dr. Nikhil. It's an excellent presentation, very informative talk. Thank you kindly for So Nikhil, and Dr. Sudipta Arun Sen is asking, apart from calcium supplementation, what else are you giving in post-op cases of parathyroidectomy? Other than calcium, magnesium, you're told. Is there anything else?
Vitamin D and multivitamins, B
Neurobion
complex.
and B1, B6, B12 combination.
Okay. So Dr. Devi Dugadas is again asking, why do you cut into pieces? That means this is the specimen. You cut into pieces specimen?
No. That in case you're auto transplanting, not otherwise.
Yeah.
The
Okay,
question
you're
was
doing,
for,
you're doing. Yes.
yeah, so that it takes up easily. So that's the point. In case you want to do it, but of course we don't auto transplant. It's only when she was referring to you're doing a total thyroidectomy and it was an accidentally that your gland you have to remove for whatever reason. For the hyperplasia or the adenoma, of course, we would not do that.
Yeah. Dr. Hassan is asking, did you do or perform surgery under local anesthesia anytime? Parathyroid surgery?
We have an anesthetist always available, an excellent anesthetist team.
Yeah.
That
Yes, it doesn't make any sense to operate under local.
But it can very well be done under local anesthesia.
See, this is a tertiary or quaternary referral center, AIIMS being must be one of the best facilities. Again, compliments from Dr. Sanjeev Gollar. Good discussion and information.
Yeah, great. Sir, senior from PGI, so we welcome Professor Gollar.
Yeah. And next question, if we implant the parathyroid in the sternomastoid and unfortunately it comes out to be malignancy and need radiation, then parathyroid may become unviable. So better to implant forearm. This is a impression Dr. Rounds, I don't know, he has not mentioned.
I'll mention. You see, we are talking here of auto transplantation when you're doing a total thyroidectomy. Okay.
Yeah.
If you're doing it in a benign disease, there is no such issue, because total thyroidectomy you could be doing for a benign disease, you could be doing for a malignancy. Malignancy could be papillary carcinoma, follicular carcinoma, one of those well differentiated ones. So, or medullary thyroid cancers. In that case, if there is any doubt, because the gland is just next to the tumor tissue, it is then not auto-transplanted to be on the safer side. If you're doing it in a benign disease and you've accidentally removed the parathyroid, we are talking of auto-transplantation only in those cases. We are not talking in cases of parathyroid adenoma. We are not talking in cases of thyroid malignancies also. It should be avoided at least in those cases then.
Yeah, Dr. Neva Wama and Dr. Hassan, they again compliments, wonderful presentation, very informative discussion. And then Dr. Redby, he has not mentioned his name. Role of genetic screening in hyperparathyroidism.
Yeah, there is definite role of genetic screening, especially in hereditary syndromic hyperparathyroidism. There is like MEN 1, MEN 2, then hyperparathyroidism, jaw tumor syndrome. All these genetic screening is important in patient and patient's family members as well.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, both of you, sirs, Dr. Rupa ma'am and Nitin sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Munka sir. Again, parathyroid was not discussed in any of webinars in the lockdown period. I think this was an outstanding presentation in that case, because Dr. Munka sir, he is following most of the webinars. He has better knowledge about this thing. Anyway, we are trying to identify the talent and the uncut diamonds from all over the country, and yeah, this was something suddenly coming topic coming from some unexpected places for our audience, our dedicated audience. We have a set of dedicated audience who visit our program, and really it was great honor for us to have both of you on this program, sir. Look forward to have more from you, more contribution from AIIMS Raipur. Please do contribute.
You've been doing a wonderful job, and we all know that. I know you for so many now, so almost 35 years, I would say. It's so nice to see you doing well and taking interest for the specialty. You've already done well for yourself, but now you're doing for your fraternity, which is actually a wonderful step, especially in these times. I've got a wonderful team over here, Dr. Ripudaman, Dr. Rupa, and Dr. Satish. You know all of them.
Yes, sir.
I'm very happy to see so many seniors of ours are here today. My special thanks to Dr. Matreja, Professor Golhar, Dr. Munka. I got to hear from him after a long time. He's again our senior from Bihar, Jharkhand. So my, compliments to him also, and everybody who has joined us today. Dr. Rupa.
We had an international audience. I'm proud to say, just not from India. We had about from 7 countries. From Indonesia, Middle East, Africa, and different places. Really, it was it's taking India far wide, across the nine seas, I would say. So thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Look forward to have you all again, on the program. Actually, Nitin sir, someday I would like to, I want you to speak about the leadership, this thing you have taken in during COVID-19 situation, what you have done, what steps you have taken. I think that you should share some time, how you have managed this COVID-19.
If it's, I think 2 weeks later, just we will have a wonderful presentation on that part.
Yes, sir. Please, I would like to, listen that part of this thing, and I think a lot of, from all over India, I think all our colleagues will be interested to hear more, about that than this thing.
Okay. Yeah, we have already treated almost 1,200 COVID positive patients over here in our own institute.
That's a big number.
A big number. So we'll definitely share our experiences.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I think you should please, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Yeah. Take care of yourself. Take good care of yourself, all of you. Yeah.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Yeah.